Opening up flexible options, knight to f3 immediately aims for central influence and prepares castling, a solid, understated start. Opening the kingside flank so aggressively immediately creates dynamic possibilities, but also potentially weakens the king's shelter. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop, creating a strong defensive structure and aiming for kingside control. Developing the knight to its natural square, preparing to castle and contest the center. Positioning the bishop here eyes the weakened kingside, preparing for a future pawn push or tactical strike. Solidifying the center allows for future pawn pushes and prepares development of the queen's bishop. Securing the monarch in its castle offers vital defensive assurance, paving the way for central pawn expansion. Developing the bishop to its most natural square prepares castling and connects the rooks, a solid step in the opening. Securing central space with pawn advances sets the stage for queenside expansion. Securing the monarch now is a sensible defensive maneuver, aligning with the general cautious approach of the opening. Preparing to support the queenside and contest the d4 square, this quiet maneuver aims to solidify white's pawn structure while potentially opening lines for the bishop. The queen's relocation to e8 seeks to facilitate further queenside development, perhaps intending a future c5 advance while avoiding early central skirmishes. Developing the knight here aims to bolster central control and prepare for potential kingside pressure, eyeing open lines. Unleashing the queen so early risks isolating her, potentially creating a tactical target and sacrificing valuable tempo. Repositioning the queen to a safer diagonal addresses immediate threats while preparing to support potential kingside expansion. Solidifying central presence, this knight prepares to challenge white's queenside pawns. Asserting central control and preparing to activate the light-squared bishop after this pawn push. Solidifying the center with d6 prepares for a potential pawn push on e5 and anchors the kingside's defensive structure. Opening the long diagonal to pressure black's queenside and potentially prepare a kingside advance. A dormant rook awakens, potentially eyeing the c-file or supporting a pawn push, but it feels a bit passively placed for now. Centralizing the rook on the d-file aims to leverage the open lines and prepare for potential pawn breaks, creating a more active piece presence. Activating the bishop to a more supportive diagonal, aiming to bolster the queenside pawns and potentially contest central squares. Sensing a strategic opportunity, white boldly injects a pawn, seeking to dominate the central expanse and potentially disrupt black's king's safety. Recapturing that pawn looks passive, allowing white to dominate the center. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal with this pawn exchange creates significant central pressure, forcing a strategic reevaluation for black's queenside. This captures the pawn, unlocking the bishop's diagonal and creating a central pawn chain. Aggressively cracking open the queenside, white seeks to exploit any lingering weaknesses on that flank. Opening the d-file for white's rook, this captures a pawn but allows for a dangerous kingside attack. Reclaiming central influence and preparing to harass the queenside pawns. Challenging the center and its controlling knight with a direct counterthrust. Pushing the queen into the fray offers a chance to challenge black's knights and break their defensive shield. Black gambles on a misplaced knight, hoping to disrupt white's king's safety with immediate contact. Liberating the dark-squared bishop's diagonals offers white a potent attacking initiative. Opening the f-file for your rook unleashes its latent power, potentially targeting the weakened kingside. Seizing the initiative, white sacrifices material to expose black's vulnerable king and open aggressive lines. Reclaiming the initiative with the rook, this maneuver prepares to exploit the exposed white king and pressure the queenside. Unlocking the kingside attack by opening lines for the queen and rook offers exciting possibilities. Opening the bishop's diagonal to potentially disrupt white's king safety. Sacrificing the bishop to gain a clear open king and dismantling black's central control. Liberating the knight to this outpost secures a vital central square and initiates a dynamic counterplay. unleashing a knight to centralize and threaten the black king's immediate defenses. Asserting central control with the knight, this piece immediately creates havoc among white's queenside structure. Reoccupying the open bishop's diagonal offers a new angle for attack, preparing to exploit any weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Unleashing the rook to challenge the open file and pierce white's defenses. Concentrating fire on the dark squares, aiming to exploit black's weakened king defense. A daring maneuver, shifting focus to the king side and threatening to unravel white's defenses with its unusual placement. Exchanges a vital bishop for a pawn, opening lines and simplifying into an endgame where black's king's safety is still a concern. Reclaiming central influence with this pawn exchanged, sacrifices immediate piece activity for crucial space. Pushing the pawn aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and open lines for attack. Embracing the open file, this capture ignites lines toward the beleaguered white king, a bold gamble for counterplay. Reclaiming the open file, this rook transfer reestablishes crucial defensive pressure on black's compromised king. Shifting the queen to the center might look active, but it abandons the d-pawn and allows white's pieces to swarm. Reclaiming the open file is paramount now that the dust has settled. The king's relocation to f7, escaping the now open files, signifies a crucial transition towards defensive consolidation, aiming to shield its newly exposed position. This rook repositioning aims to sever black's central control and exploit the open d-file for pressure. Trading queens simplifies into a stark battle for the initiative with black's isolated d-pawn. Relinquishing the queen trade simplifies the position, aiming for a winning endgame with the extra pawn. Re-establishing pawn control across the center is crucial after the exchanges, though the isolated queen's pawn presents a lingering weakness. Securing the king is paramount as the rook and pawns become more active. This king repositioning prepares for the inevitable pawn endgame. Re-establishing central presence with the rook, aiming to challenge white's control of the d-file and prepare for future king safety maneuvers. Asserting dominion over the queenside ranks, this rook seeks to disrupt black's developing queenside presence and coordinate an endgame advantage. Reclaiming the open file is paramount for your rook's activity. Activating the knight to a more central outpost offers increased influence over key squares. Exchanging rooks simplifies the position, but white's remaining knight becomes more influential. Unlocking the queenside with the knight's march prepares for queenside pawn advances. Your king is finally emerging from its shell, but its journey across the board might be fraught with peril given the remaining pawns. Initiating king activity secures crucial central influence and prepares for the impending pawn endgame race. Shifting the king forward unlocks potential for counterplay and active piece deployment. Pushing the king forward now actively seeks centralizing control and prepares for potential pawn advances in the endgame. The king ventures towards the center, seeking opportunities while the knight eyes potential targets on the queen side. Securing the king side with this pawn advance intends to foster a more robust defensive setup. Reinforcing the king's safety with piece cooperation is paramount in this imbalanced pawn structure. Activating the knight to a central outpost after the exchange solidifies king safety and prepares a kingside pawn push. Unleashing the monarch allows it to seek central influence and support its remaining pawns. Knight repositions, eyeing the weak kingside pawns and preparing to disrupt black's unified pawn structure. Relocating the bishop to c7 aims to unblock the passed pawn on c5 and potentially attack white's knight. Repositioning the king to a more active central outpost, aiming to escort the pawns and restrict the enemy bishop. Pushing the king deeper into enemy territory invites potential harassment and complications. A knight's fork on the king and bishop, a surprising tactical shot that forces a difficult choice for black. The king courageously ventures into enemy territory, seeking active participation in the endgame's unfolding drama. Reasserting central control, the white king prepares to advance and support its pawns. King marching forward, aiming to occupy open central squares and challenge white's isolated pawn. Gaining kingside initiative by forcing the opponent's monarch into a cornered, exposed position. Reactivating the knight's potential to exploit the exposed king is a wise decision. The white king retreats, seeking a safer haven from the advancing pawns and potential discovered attacks. The king ventures out, seeking activity but exposes itself to potential discoveries. The knight's discovered check forces black's king to retreat, solidifying white's control over key squares and preparing further infiltration. The king's perpetual chase for squares offers little sanctuary, leaving the queenside pawns vulnerable to the knight's advance. The king's journey continues, seeking a safer haven amidst the pawn structure's complexities. The black king ventures out, seeking space but risks exposure in the open. Pushing the g-pawn opens lines but weakens your king's defense, potentially creating targets for black's pieces. The king's prolonged excursion into enemy territory is starting to look precarious, with support distant. Shaping the pawn structure near the king to prevent immediate counterplay and prepare for a slow kingside advance. Repositioning the bishop to eye the pawn chain is a sensible defensive maneuver. Regrouping the king allows for a more flexible pawn push on the queen side. This bishop repositions, seeking improved control of the central diagonal and potential outpost squares. King activation finally begins, seeking better central influence and potential outposts. Asserting control over the central squares, this piece now actively prevents white's king from finding refuge on the light squares. Knight repositions to eye the vulnerable bishop's diagonal and potential outpost on d6. The bishop repositions, seeking a more active diagonal and aiming to bolster the central pawn structure. Pressing the knight to a more active diagonal targets the king's weakened pawn shield. The pawn advances, seeking to create an outpost or a passed pawn while potentially weakening the king's pawn shield. A tactical geometry shift, repositioning the knight to potentially exploit the kingside pawn structure. The bishop's retreat to h4 abandons the central dark squares, potentially enabling white's knight to infiltrate and control key territory. A check that forces the black king into a more confined area, limiting its mobility for the upcoming endgame. Securing the king's escape route to safety before advancing the pawns. The king marches forward, seeking new avenues of activity in the simplified territory. bf6 aims to bolster the king's safety and potentially prepare a pawn push, creating a more dynamic endgame. The knight retreats, conceding the central outpost and preparing to contest the queenside pawns. Hoping to create a fortress for the king, but this opens up diagonal penetration. Securing the knight on a potentially active outpost, aiming to disrupt black's rook's influence. The black king, after a long journey, seeks respite and a more active role on the central squares. Controlling the outpost square b5 is key to improving the knight's activity and pressuring black's pawn structure. Establishing a foothold on the queenside aims to disrupt white's knight and create queenside play. Knight fork, this checks the king and threatens the bishop, disrupting black's position. Black's king finds temporary refuge in the center, hoping to coordinate its defense with the remaining pawns against the looming knight. Navigating the knight to a central outpost offers improved scope and a potential jump into black's weakened kingside. Asserting control over the open c-file is a paramount objective now. Seizing the open file with the knight provides a vital outpost.